Looks like we've got most people back. And our next presenter is Amanda from the Johnson Library, as if you couldn't guess by her background. And she's going to be talking to you again more on our theme, Presidents and the Constitution and the realms of civil rights, which ties well in with our previous session. So thanks again, if they're still around, to Kathleen and Joy. And now we move to the south to Austin, Texas. And Amanda, great. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. I am happy to be here with y'all today. I'm going to share my screen while I'm starting this. I am, as Mark said, I am with the Johnson Library. I've been with the library for 11 years. Previously, I was a classroom teacher. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about voting rights and LBJ's work towards voting rights. I'm using a bunch of our primary sources that we have in our library. I'm also using a truncated version of this presentation, and I'll share with you right now. The expanded version of this can be found on lbjlibrary.org/education. And then we have a web version. I will share all of these links with you or through Mark, but I can also put them in the chat box, which actually let me exit my presentation and just do that right now, so you have the links that I'm going to talk about, so you can look through them and you don't have to take a million notes if you don't want to. How do I get to the chat box? There we go. There are the 3 links. The first one is to lbjlibrary.org/education. As you scroll down, you can see all of our offerings. Most of them will take you to a Dropbox where you can find the presentation as well as the supporting documents. You'll also find the web version of this. At the beginning of the pandemic, we tried to transform some of our curriculum to online sources, so you could actually assign it to your students to do, and it walks them through all of it without you having to be there to do the presentation to them. So this obviously can be used in a non-virtual setting with your students. It just depends on how you want to do it. But you'll have access through that Dropbox link to the full presentation, the teacher guide of how to present, what you can talk about with the presentation, questions you can ask, supporting documents, all the telephone conversations, photos, just everything you might ever want to go with this. So I'm going to walk through it a little bit like I would with students, and then skipping through some of the student questions because we are on a shortened amount of time than I would possibly typically do this presentation. So with that being said, also, if you have questions about any of this stuff, feel free to throw questions in the chat box. My colleague, Sheila Mehta, is our foundation education specialist at the library. She is in here as well. She might jump in and answer some questions, or I can obviously answer them at the end of the session. So there's Sheila right there saying hi to y'all. Okay, so we introduced voting rights. The Voting Rights Act followed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Voting rights eventually was passed in 1965. LBJ did not have a strong voting rights piece in the Civil Rights Act because he knew that not everything was going to be able to get passed in that first act, but he immediately followed it with the Voting Rights Act. And we tried to kind of put it into perspective by using something like this, which is a quiz, a literacy test. This one specifically is the Mississippi literacy test that not all folks had to take when they were registering to vote or going up to vote. Sometimes I'll give this to students and have them attempt to answer the questions themselves, or we'll just talk about it as a group. But you can kind of skim through it yourself and see that some of the questions are, basic questions of what is your name? Do you have an employer? But then they get into really specific things on the second page, like write and copy in this space below section, whatever, of the Constitution of Mississippi. And then it goes on to explaining the meaning of the Constitution of Mississippi. And if you think about whatever state that you're from, or even the United States Constitution, if you would be able to do that, and students often sit in the same place where I sit up, if someone gave me a specific piece of the Constitution without just saying section, article 1, section 3, what is that one? off the top of my head, I don't know. Some of you might as, social studies educators, but it's not common for folks to know these answers. And so we ask a lot about, like, what is the purpose of this? Why do they need this? What other methods were being used to prevent African Americans from voting? Specifically, African Americans were given this test. Sometimes poor white folks were given this test as well. Really, it was just used to limit registration. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to play and show for you today comes from our collection. We have a lot of telephone conversations. It's really like the gem of our collection. I'm going to play some really fantastic ones today for you, some of our most popular ones, LBJ talking to Martin Luther King in particular, because they work together around passing the Voting Rights Act. There's a lot of conversations around the movie Selma. I know I had a conversation with Kathleen and some teachers with the Clinton Library earlier this summer that, the movie Selma really represents LBJ as more of an adversary than working alongside MLK, for example, and the civil rights workers. But when you look at our holdings at the LBJ Library and you listen to these telephone conversations, you can really hear LBJ's support, and also understanding that he is aware of the limits of what he can do without the American people being on board. So this first conversation I'm going to play for you here is a conversation just days after JFK was assassinated. It was one of the first conversations. LBJ immediately spoke with Dr. Martin Luther King, and they discussed sort of how they can work together to further the cause of civil rights. I will say that some of these conversations are a little hard to hear. When I play it with students, I try to play it more than once, give them a guide or something to use with it. Additionally, we have a new website. I'll share that link with y'all. I did not prepare that one, sorry. That includes a few more transcripts. So you'll be able to have some transcripts. The library itself doesn't have transcripts for our phone conversations, but we partnered with the Miller Center, and there are some transcripts now for a lot of these conversations that are available. So I'm going to play this conversation, and then we can talk a little bit about what you see here. I will also mention, I guess that y'all can also see the captions that I have at the bottom. They don't listen very well to the conversation, so they might be distracting because they don't hear LBJ and MLK quite as clearly, but let's go ahead and listen.
Interest and your cooperation and your communication, and a good many people told me that they heard about your statement, I guess on TV, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right. I've been locked up in this office and I haven't seen it, but I want to tell you how grateful I am and how worthy I'm going to try to be of all your hopes. Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that, and I knew that you had just that great spirit, and you have our support and backing. Well, we know what a difficult period this is. It's just an impossible period. We got a budget coming up that's got nothing to do with it. It's practically already made, and we got a civil rights bill that hasn't even passed the House, and it's November, and Hubert Humphrey told me yesterday everybody wanted to go home. We've got a tax bill that they haven't touched. We just got to not let up on any of them and keep going. And I guess they'll say that I'm repudiated, but I'm going to ask the Congress Wednesday to just stay there, let pass them all. They won't do it, but we'll just keep them there next year till they do it, and we just won't give up an inch. Well, this is mighty fine. I think it's so imperative. I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate. But I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now. Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything. Thank you so much, Mark. All right, call me when you I sure will. Call me when you're down here next time. I certainly will. But let's get together, and any suggestions you got, bring them in. Fine, I certainly will do that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so this sets us up for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was passed on July 2nd. You can see Martin Luther King standing there right behind LBJ. And like I said before, this act was very important, and it was extending the legacy of JFK, what he had been working on, and it took a lot for LBJ to get that to pass. But it wasn't strong in voting rights. There was still a lot lacking, and LBJ didn't have the political capital quite yet to pass the Voting Rights Act. So I'm going to play for you guys there's the actual Civil Rights Act. Andrew Young spoke at the LBJ Library in 2004 at the Civil Rights and he spoke about talking to Dr. King about his visit with President Johnson as they discussed a Voting Rights Act and what that could look like and how they could work together. So let's listen to Andrew Young, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Right after the Nobel Prize, President Johnson talked for an hour about why he didn't have the power to introduce voting rights legislation in 1965 and gave very good reasons. But he kept saying, I just don't have the power. I wish I did. When we left, I asked Dr. King, well, what did you think? He said, I think we got to figure out a way to get this president some power. And I thought at the time that it was awful arrogant of him to say that, except that we had not been back in Atlanta for 3 days before Amelia Boynton came over from Selma with a report on the voting atrocities in Selma and pleading with Dr. King, you've got to come help us in Selma. And this was not anything we were aware of or planned. It was thrust upon us. And we went to Selma on the 2nd of January. And by the end of March, the president had all the power he needed to get that Voting Rights Act introduced.
So you heard what he said there. So we're going to kind of dive into Selma a little bit here through our archival documents. And this is really kind of an interesting thing to look at.
Right after the...
On Martin Luther King's 36th birthday, January 15th, 1965, LBJ called him and had a conversation. They're going to talk about the number of African Americans who are registered to vote in the South and what needs to be done to get this passed. So we've heard that Martin Luther King wants to get LBJ that power. He's also said that they know what's going on in Selma now. So let's hear what Dr. King and LBJ say to each other. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to go that way. There we go.
And it's very interesting, Mr. President, to notice that the only state that you didn't carry the South, the southern states, have less than 48% of the Negroes present with the vote. Very interesting to notice that. I think the President of the University of Texas, a recent article brought this out very clearly. So it demonstrates that it's so important to get Negroes registered to vote in large numbers in the South. And it would be this coalition of the Negro vote and the moderate white vote that will really make the new South. That's exactly right. I think it's very important that we not just say that we're doing this and we're not doing it just because it's Negroes or whites, but we take the position that every person born in this country, when he reaches a certain age, that he have a right to vote, just like he has a right to fight, and that we just extend it, whether it's a Negro, whether it's a Mexican, or who it is. And number two, I think that we don't want special privilege for anybody. We want equality for all, and we can stand on that principle. But I think if you can contribute a great deal by getting your leaders and you yourself taking very simple examples of discrimination, where a man's got to memorize a Longfellow, where he's got to quote the first 10 amendments, or he's got to tell you what Amendment 15, 16, 17 is, and then ask them if they know, and show what happens. And some people don't have to do that. But when a Negro comes in, he's got to do it. And we can just repeat and repeat and repeat. And if you can find the worst condition that you run into in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana, or South Carolina, and if you just take that one illustration and get it on radio and get it on television, get it on in the pulpits, get it in the meetings, get it every place you can. Pretty soon, the fellow that didn't do anything but drive a tractor, he'll say, well, that's not right, that's not fair. And then that tells us on what we're going to shove through in the end. And if we do that, we'll break through it'll be the greatest breakthrough of anything, not even except in this 64 Act. I think the greatest achievement of my administration, I think the greatest achievement in foreign policy, I said to a group yesterday, was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But I think this will be bigger.
So that conversation I find so interesting because of the different points that LBJ makes. And this is an interesting conversation to have with students. I was thinking as I was listening to it, thinking about the things that Kathleen and Joy were saying at the end of their last presentation about how we talk about history and we think about it happening so long ago. But this was, not that long ago that African Americans didn't have the right to vote. Legally, yes, we know that they did have the right to vote legally per amendments, but not through Jim Crow laws and voter restrictions. And just to be able to see the atrocities and the things that were happening to these folks, that guy who just drives a tractor is going to say that's not fair, that's not right. Students really pick up on that and make connections to what's going on today. And I think even more so, I think our students this year will see there's so much conversation around voting rights and looking back at the 1965 Act and what has changed, what might be taken away and might be reinforced, like the John Lewis bill that's out there right now to kind of bring back some more of the original Voting Rights Act that has been stripped back over the years. Or in individual states. I live in Texas. There are some voting rights bills that are on the floor right now. That's why the Democrats left Texas to go to DC right now. So there's a lot of conversation, I think, that can be had that relates to what's happening here. There's a lot of other stuff going on, not just the Voting Rights Act. Typically, I would play a conversation right now with Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, talking about elementary and secondary education and how that's going to help. LBJ, we talk about him like this as the civil rights president. He often said that education would help with all of the other kind of great society programming. If you could educate somebody, they're going to be able to get out of poverty and all the different aspects. And so there's a lot that needs to happen for voting rights to pass as well. Getting into Selma, I imagine that most of you are familiar with Bloody Sunday. On March 7th, 1965, there was the first attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery. We can see here in the front is John Lewis, was one of the marchers. And there some words from John Lewis I'm going to read to y'all because I don't have the audio for it. It says, on March 7th, 1965, we had planned to march from Selma to Montgomery, about 50 miles, to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people of color wanted to register to vote. But on the march of March 7th, 1965, we started walking slowly through the streets of Selma. We crossed the Alabama River, crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and when we got to the highest point on the bridge, we saw a sea of blue Alabama state troopers, and we continued to walk and come within hearing distance of the state troopers. A man spoke up and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march, will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And one of the young men leading the march with me said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troops, advance." We saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came towards us, beating us with nightsticks, bullwhips, trampling us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. Somehow I made it to the back of the church. The church was packed, more than 2,000 people on the outside trying to get in to protest what had happened. The next thing I knew, I had been admitted to the local hospital in Selma, Alabama, along with 17 other people. 17 people were hospitalized with serious injuries and 50 were treated for lesser injuries. That footage, though, people on television. Press covered Bloody Sunday, including the graphic images of the police beating the peaceful protesters, and it triggered a national outrage. That Sunday evening, Dr. King began calling on sympathetic citizens and religious leaders to join him on Tuesday in a peaceful, nonviolent march for freedom. This is a Spider Martin image. We have a few different Spider Martin images. He took the most iconic photos from that day that we use here in this presentation. I want to follow that up. So that was on March 7th. March 9th, Bill Moyers was LBJ's press secretary at the time. And he has a telephone conversation with LBJ and talks about what happened and then what needs to happen next, because the marchers are going to continue. They want to do another march. Martin Luther King has called for another peaceful march to happen. And if you know anything about Alabama at the time, Governor Wallace is not happy. They don't want this to happen. They don't want all of this media attention. And then they definitely don't want federal involvement in what's going on. So Bill Moyers is going to kind of brief the president on what's happening, and we can talk about that, and we'll see all the follow-up as well.
Yeah, yes, it was happened. Martin Luther King, I didn't call it back on his 4 o'clock when he finally called back. But the whole arrangement is this, that they will march. They'll march at the same point they were. They'll sing and pray for less than an hour, and then disperse peacefully. Wallace says he will maintain law and order. I don't know what will happen to rowdies and stuff, but he will maintain law and order. He's talking about calling up the National Guard, which we don't want him to do. We suggested to Ellington that he handle it is to say that he's just talking as an individual, but he knows that telegrams and everything been flowing in Washington urging the president to do something, and that if Wallace calls up the National Guard to halt the march, it'll only increase the pressure on justice to use the National Guard to protect the marchers. So Ellington is at this very moment talking to Wallace. That's where it stands. Very tenuous, but that's it. Why wouldn't they go with what they agreed on earlier? Join the court, and then send yeah. He says that his King says his left wingers will not let the day go by without some symbol of a march. With all these people pouring in there, you just got to establish that they have the principle, at least to march. The pressure was just too much, he claims, from that side. Katzenbach told me about 7 that he talked to him again, and then he was very fearful for his life, and he really wanted out of it. That he couldn't get out of at least a token march around Selma. We'll start at 11 o'clock our time, and the best we can do now is just hope that Wallace will be true to his word, and the King will break them up peacefully after 35 or 40 minutes of singing and praying.
So on March 9th, that was the day that King appeared ready to violate the federal order. He led 2,500 marchers to the bridge, including hundreds of clergy. At the site of the Bloody Sunday attack, they stopped and knelt and they prayed. After praying, they rose and they turned back, avoiding another confrontation. At the same time, there were civil rights movement attorneys filing suit in federal district court seeking an injunction forbidding law enforcement to interfere with the protest. There was an order to cancel the march planned on Tuesday. And so that is why Dr. King marched, prayed, and turned around so that he would not be violating the orders. The president released a statement on March 9th, which you can read here on the screen. Students, I would have them read this, or we could read it together. It is kind of long, but we talk about really what is the position of the White House regarding the events in Selma. So Americans everywhere join in deploring the brutality with which a number of Negro citizens of Alabama were treated when they sought to dramatize their deep and sincere interest in attaining the precious right to vote. The best legal talent in the federal government is engaged in preparing legislation that will secure the right for every American. I expect to complete work on my recommendations by this weekend and shall dispatch a special message to the Congress as soon as drafting of the legislation is finished. So you can see that the president here is standing with the Dr. King and the protesters, which from behind the scenes we knew, but this is out, to the public. It's saying we're going to continue our efforts at the bottom there to work with the individuals involved to relieve tensions and to make it possible for every citizen to vote. I urge all who are in positions of leadership and capable of influencing the conduct of others to approach this tense situation with calmness, reasonableness, and respect for law and order. We can see on March 12th, right? Is that what that says? Yeah, March 12th. To the president from George Wallace. He sent this telegram, and I'm going to read this one to you. I think this one is an interesting telegram, and this will tell us George Wallace's position on the state of Alabama and the events in Selma. He says, the situation existing in Selma, Alabama, which is not unlike recent occurrences in other states, poses some of the greatest internal problems ever faced by this nation. Voter registration and voting rights are not the issues involved in these street demonstrations. The voting rights of every person in Alabama are now being considered by litigation pending in the federal courts. I have said many times before, and I say again, that any individual who is qualified to vote is entitled to vote. The activities of the civil rights leaders are directed towards the defiance of Lawson state and federal authority, which, if unchecked, poses a threat not only to the lives and safety of our people, but to the preservation of a lawful society. As governor, I propose to take whatever steps that are necessary to preserve order in this state and to protect all of the people in Alabama. State authorities are completely adequate to cope with the situation, although our task is difficult because the leader of the demonstrations has testified in federal court that he obeys only the laws of which he approves. However, a solution leading to the cessation of these demonstrations is of urgent need. I feel a discussion with you of these problems will be of great benefit to Alabama and the entire country. Accordingly, I respectfully request an appointment. So George Wallace wants to meet with the president. He is saying that there is no threat to voting rights in Alabama. It is something else, right? So there is a meeting between George Wallace. He's flown up to the White House and he meets with President Johnson on March 13th. So just a few days later, this is them at the White House. There's an oral history from Richard Goodwin, who was a special assistant to the president, that I'm going to read some of this to you. It says, Wallace sent this telegram to the White House saying he'd like to meet with the president to discuss the situation. Johnson said, well, you just come right ahead. Wallace is about 5'4", and Johnson was about 6'4", as you can see the height difference in the picture. So he leads Wallace in and sits him down on the couch. Wallace sits on the couch, and now he's about 3 feet tall. And Johnson sits on the edge of his rocking chair, leaning over him. And Johnson's Southern voice always deepened when he spoke to other Southerners. And he says, now, you agree that the Negroes got to vote, don't you? And he said, oh, yes, Mr. President. There's no point about that, he says. Then why don't you let them vote? And he says, well, now I don't have that power. That belongs to the county registrars in the state of Alabama. And Wallace insists that no, he didn't have the legal authority. Well, why don't you persuade them, George, he says. Well, I don't think I can do that, he said. Now, don't you shit me about your persuasive powers, George. You know I sit down in the morning when I get up and I've got 3 TVs lined up right after the other. And I had it on this morning and saw you when I pressed the button. And you was attacking me, George. You said, he says, well, I wasn't attacking you, Mr. President. I was attacking the whole principle of states' rights. And he says, you were attacking me, George, and you were so damn persuasive, I almost changed my mind. And well, that goes on for about an hour and a half or more. And he finally turns to Wallace and he says, George, you and I shouldn't be talking about 1964. We should be talking about 1984. We'll both be dead and gone then. Now, you got a lot of poor people down there in Alabama and a lot of ignorant people. A lot of people need jobs and a lot of people need a future. You could do that for them, George. Your president could help you. Now, in 1984, George, what do you want to have left behind? Do you want a great big marble monument that says George Wallace, he built? Or do you want a little piece of scrawny pine callous soil that reads George Wallace, he hated? That is the conclusion of that little oral history piece, but it gives you a good example of LBJ's Johnson treatment. After that, they hold a press conference, and we have footage of that in our related documents that you can get in that Dropbox to see the press conference that they hold after. But President Johnson essentially traps him in saying, like, this is, you want this, you're saying you don't have power, but you do have power, you are the governor. And so the president moves forward and prepares an address to Congress. It's called the American Promise speech, where he talks about voting rights. And I'm going to play a clip from that speech for you here. This was on March 15th, so just a couple days later, when the president gives this speech.
So I ask you to join me in working long hours, nights, and weekends if necessary, to pass this bill. And I don't make that request lightly. Far from the window where I sit with the problems of our country, I recognize that from outside this chamber is the outraged conscience of a nation, the grave concern of many nations, and the harsh judgment of history on our acts. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
It was very powerful that LBJ used the words, we shall overcome. Those were words that were used by the movement. Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders used those terms, used to the term we shall overcome from a key song in the movement. Martin Luther King Jr. watched the speech at the home of Jimmy Jackson, who had been killed by police during a march in Marion, Alabama. And John Lewis was with him and often recalled that moment. He said, I was in the home of Dr. Jackson in Selma, where we watched and listened to Lyndon Johnson. There were 2 or 3 of us, with Dr. King, and when President Johnson said, we shall overcome, I looked at Dr. King and tears came down his face. We all cried a little to have the President of the United States say, we shall overcome. And Dr. King said, we will march from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act will be passed. It's such a powerful moment for the movement and for President Johnson to really show his alliance with the movement. So here we have a telegram from Martin Luther King to President Johnson on the 16th, and then the response from the president on the 18th. He says, your speech at the joint session of Congress last night was the most moving, eloquent, unequivocal, and passionate plea for human rights ever made by any president of this nation. You evidenced amazing understanding of the depth and dimensions of the problems that we face in our struggle. Your tone was sincere throughout, and your persuasive power was never more forceful. We are ready to join with you in a quick passage of the voting bill. Please know that we are deeply encouraged and inspired by your support and leadership. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King got the response from LBJ 2 days later. I appreciate your generous comments about my address to Congress and the nation. I sincerely believe that the mood of the country and Congress offers us an opportunity to secure legislation, which will provide a direct, quick, effective, and constitutional means of ensuring all citizens will be able to register and vote. I fully appreciate the tensions under which you are laboring, and I am confident that you will continue to offer a course of leadership that will permit us to move toward our goal of universal suffrage. Again, if you use the movie Selma in your classroom, these are really beautiful documents that really support the leadership of LBJ in supporting the civil rights leaders and what they are doing. And it just shows, I think, a really beautiful camaraderie between the two men as well. It's not just a political relationship there. This is on the 18th, I believe, right? Yes, March 18th. So the same day that LBJ sent that response to Dr. King, the governor of Alabama sends another telegram to President Johnson. He is asking some questions. So let's see what he's asking. He says, with regards to the order of the Federal District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, providing a plan for the so-called march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the Department of Public Safety of the state of Alabama advises me that the following personnel will be required in order to provide maximum security. So he names off all of these things and he says that these are the state troopers that we have available. And this is the other folks that we could have. But I request that the United States provides federal civil authorities or officers to provide safety and welfare of the citizens along the march route. He says that they can work with the state of Alabama, but that they don't have enough folks to keep everybody safe. In this follow-up, the president responds, wait, no, is this the president? This is George Wallace, sorry, the next day, responding and saying, the president of the United States, I would like to, hold on, sorry. The portions of the resolution passed on this day, the Senate and the House of Representatives of the state of Alabama says as follows. The governor of Alabama requests to inform the president of the United States that the state of Alabama is willing to call the National Guard of this state to state active duty at any time to protect the life and property of the people of the state. However, the proposed march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama by so-called demonstrators along the U.S. highway have been ordered by a federal court, and financial resources of the federal government should be used to pay for the cost of mobilization of the National Guard of Alabama. For this reason, as well as for the reasons hereinafter set forth, the legislature of Alabama is unwilling to recommend that the Guard be called. They also say that the state of Alabama is not financially able to pay for this. They continue to call them so-called demonstrators, and the relation to the federal court being called they need to provide, the president needs to be funding all of this. So he says, I'm willing to maintain a peace and order, but we are unable to financially do that. So this is the response from the White House. There's a telephone conversation that is in the full presentation that you can download from our Dropbox with the Director of Emergency Planning to talk about the issues and the funding and the National Guard cooperation. But to get through our point here, we can see that Lyndon Johnson responds and he says, responsibility for maintaining law and order in our federal system properly rests with state and local governments. On the basis of your public statements and your discussions with me, I thought that you felt strongly, I can't read, that's too small on my screen, about this, and promised to take all necessary, probably means. I was surprised, therefore, when your telegram Thursday requested federal assistance in the performance of such fundamental state duties. Even more surprising was your telegram of yesterday stating that you and the Alabama legislature believe that the state is unable to protect citizens and to maintain peace and order in a responsible manner without federal forces. Because the court order must be obeyed and the rights of American citizens protected, I intend to meet your request by providing federal assistance to perform normal police functions. I am calling into federal service selected units of the Alabama National Guard and will also have available police units from the regular Army to help you to meet your state's responsibilities. These forces should be adequate to assure the rights of American citizens pursuant to a federal court order to walk peacefully and safely without injury or loss of life from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. So with this, it tells us a little bit more about the relationship between the state and federal government in this time and kind of the nuances of Governor Wallace's request. And again, I feel like a little bit of the Johnson treatment in the way that that first paragraph is like, well, this is so surprising to me because I thought that you felt the same way and that you were ready to do that. So this was on March 20th. On March 21st, Dr. King led 3,200 demonstrators out of Selma under the protection of nearly 2,000 federalized Alabama National Guard troops, regular Army military police units, federal marshals, along with members of state and local law enforcement officials. On the final day, March 25th, King addressed a crowd of 25,000 people in front of the Alabama state capitol and assured them that, quote, "The end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience." And because of all of this, LBJ was able to get the Voting Rights Act passed on August 6th, 1965. And there you again see Martin Luther King and other civil rights workers or leaders there with him receiving pins from the signing of this act. The national publicity on that march from Selma to Montgomery generated enough of a role that convinced Congress to adopt the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It passed 77 to 19 in the Senate and 333 to 85 in the House. He signed it into law on August 6, 1965. It contained numerous provisions regulating the administration of elections, such as the elimination of literacy tests, and prohibited state and local voting laws that discriminated against racial minorities. The law had an immediate impact. In 1960, by the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered to vote. And I think I have a picture of the Voting Rights Act there. And that is actually the end of my presentation. I'm going to exit that and stop sharing my screen. And we can have a little bit of a conversation. I know we have, Mark said we had until noon. So if anybody has any questions about that, I know it was quick and a lot of me talking and playing stuff for you guys, but I think those links are still there. So if there's, if you have interest in those things, let me pause. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Thanks, y'all. Let me pull up the web version of this. So this is it. If you want to show your students or have your students do it, we have this interactive version online. So, you know, I think that there's probably a variety of whether or not we're hybrid next year, or maybe you still want your students to use technology. They can go through the same activity, but it's adapted for students. They're going to find clues that help African Americans find voting rights or help us get to the solve voting rights. And they'll go through this activity. There are key terms here that can help even if you're not using this activity. Other resources, whether they're from our library or this is the White House, there's TED Talks, there's SNCC because SNCC was so important in this. And then other ways in which one could take action. I know that for me, when I was a teacher, students often were like, okay, well, voting, like what does voting look like today? And what does voting look like now? And so you can kind of connect and have students take some action if you would like. And then there's instructional guide for teachers, and then additional lessons. I need to update that since Teaching Tolerance has changed their name, but this is an education project. And then we have Docs Teach, National Archives site stuff as well there. So let me look in the chat box and see. Thanks for all these compliments. Okay, so to find the information, the Dropbox link that I sent you takes you to this page here. You get the PowerPoint down here, the We Shall Overcome PowerPoint is the full PowerPoint, not the shortened one that I played for you guys today. But you can edit as however you want. Everything that we do at the library is public domain, so you can use it as you see fit. You can pick and choose, you can pull it apart. And then this is the educator guide, this next one here. And then there's background information. All the telephone conversations and documents are here. There's political cards with, so you can find everything on that Dropbox link. Additionally, if you just go to the LBJ Library Education page and you scroll down, we have, well, whenever we're back to doing tours, we have tours. But as you scroll down, you can see we offer professional development, but our curriculum is located here. So you can see where you can download lesson plans, or we have a civil rights investigation that is similar to this web-based version of this lesson. But here you can see We Shall Overcome, the Fight for Voting Rights, and then a slightly different one that can be used as well. And just all of our lesson plans, Docs Teach, Vietnam War, whatever it is that you might want to learn more about. So the transcripts, yes, let me pull up that Miller Center website real quick. I don't have it off the top of my head. This was the 50th anniversary of the LBJ Library. And so we worked with the Miller Center to create this new website. Let me open it up here. It's very simple. It's lbjtapes.org, but let me throw it in the chat for you there. There's a lot of curated content in there, and then you can see a lot of the telephone conversations are put in there by category. If you click on Browse Conversations, you can look directly at civil rights conversations, war and poverty, so on and so forth. All the different kind of major things that you might teach in your classroom. And I believe that they come up in like a video format with the transcript that can kind of play. You might be able to download the transcript as well. I haven't dug deep in there. But I will say, as with anything that you play for your students, you want to listen ahead of time. LBJ, you know, used a variety of language in his, especially when giving the Johnson treatment to folks. And so, you know, your students have probably heard those words before, but you don't want to be, you know, have a mad mama calling you saying that you were the person who exposed them to this horrible, you know, word. The other thing that I would mention vocabulary wise is that you heard a few different times the term Negro. And I think it's really important to preface your students to know that that word will be used, and that is not used anymore. But the word African American did not exist in the 1960s. It was Black or Negro. And a lot of times when you listen to folks, we have a lot of Southern legislators or congressmen talking, and when they have their Southern drawl and they say Negro, it does not sound like Negro, and they're probably not trying to make it sound like Negro. They're trying to make it sound like another word that can be triggering and is not the most acceptable for a classroom use or to be repeated necessarily, but there's a vocabulary lesson and a history lesson that can be taught there to your students, and so they don't get caught on that word. It's good to preface before you play that conversation. Make sure that they are aware that they're going to hear some things that maybe don't sound like the way folks talk today. And so hopefully that would be a little bit helpful as well. Any questions, comments? Okay, cool, y'all. If you do think of something, you are welcome to email me. I'll put my email address there. Oh, that was just me replying to one direct message. Sorry, let me do it to all. My email address in the box there, and feel free to email me ask any questions you might have, reach out to the library. And like I said, we have so many resources for y'all. If you have something else that you need information about, we would happily be a resource for you. Yeah, I know you're probably ready for lunch, so I won't keep you here any longer. Thanks for having us, Mark.
All right, thank you, Amanda. If you want to, last chance to ask questions while I get my